to Help Monday, and Jared's sitting in with us. I don't know if Jake couldn't make it this morning, but it's close to the holidays.
He's unreliable.
That's a term I've heard before. Well, Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas.
And glad you're with us this morning. Talk about a topic this morning that affects a lot of individuals, affects a lot of families. We're talking about controlled substances, and kind of share with us a little bit with the definition that might be used for that.
Well, I think starting with the definition for controlled substances is important because I think we kind of throw that term around and maybe we're not all on the same page. So let's just start with that. So a controlled substance is basically speaking, a drug or a chemical that's regulated by the government, all right? It might be the manufacture of it, it might be the possession of it, it might be the use of it, but those things are regulated by the government. And we could be talking about illicit drugs, a lot of times those are called street drugs, right? Talk about some examples in a minute, or it could be prescription drugs, but just in its basic form, a drug or chemical that's regulated by the government.
Are they all controlled substances? Are there narcotics?
Narcotics. Okay, so that's another term that I think we kind of get mixed up on, which is why I want to get to the definition of it. Narcotic, the word narcotics is from an old Greek word that means stupor. These medicines are basically used to dull the senses and relieve pain, right? So you're talking about medicines like your oxycodone or your methadone or your fentanyl. A more modern term, I guess, would be opioids, and that has to do with the way that they work in the body. So narcotic, though, is a word that is used a lot of times to refer to any controlled substance. That's not really accurate. So narcotics kind of an older, obsolete word. Opioid is a better word, really, for what we're talking about when we're talking about narcotics.
So how does the DEA describe if something is or is not a controlled substance?
Yeah, so there's three things the DEA uses when they're trying to figure out if something's a controlled substance. For example, your blood pressure medicine, right, is not a controlled substance. But the first thing is there a medical use for it? Some things are controlled substances in category 1. We'll talk about that more in just a second, but that would be things like heroin or LSD or ecstasy. There's no medical use for those. So they're in controlled substance schedule 1. Those are things you'll never find in the pharmacy, right? There are others that are medical uses for, but yet they're very addictive or they have a high potential for abuse. So is there a medical use? What's the potential for abuse and what's the potential for addiction? Those are three things that they're looking for to determine that.
So what are some of the basic rules for prescriptions?
Well, you guys, if you've ever had a controlled substance prescription, you've been through some of this before. Some of your prescriptions, you may notice, don't have any refills or can't have any refills by law. Some of your prescriptions are capped out at 5 refills, or they expire after 6 months, whether they have refills left or not. Those are all controlled substance prescriptions, but they're categorized differently. So give me just a minute. I'm gonna go over some of these categories. Already talked about, there's 5 schedules. This is regulated by the DEA. It's a drug enforcement agency, right? The DEA, and they have something called the Controlled Substances Act. That's the law that kind of regulates all this mess. Again, Schedule 1 are things that you're not going to see in the pharmacy. Heroin, LSD, those sort of things. We call those street drugs or illicit drugs, right? Funny enough, cannabis or marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug, although it's legal in many states. And there actually is a medical use for that. So, I mean, I expect that to change eventually. You know, we'll probably have that legal everywhere before too much longer, at least for medicinal purposes, right? But anyway, Schedule 1 stuff you're not going to see in the pharmacy. Those are street drugs. Schedule 2 are your things like some of your pain medicines, your Norco, which is hydrocodone, your Percocet, which is oxycodone. You guys have heard of these. And then a lot of your ADHD medicines. You guys have heard of Adderall or Ritalin. Those kind of medicines are Schedule 2. They have medical use, but it's more limited. They have a really high potential for abuse and a really high potential for addiction. And so these medications are allowed to be written, but for no refills. So you guys, some of you guys who are on pain medicine will know that sometimes your doctor will give you a prescription for this month. then on a separate piece of paper for next month, then on a separate piece of paper for the month after that, because they're not allowed to have refills legally. Or if they send them in electronically, they may send the pharmacy 3 separate ones, and we have to put 2 of them on hold and fill 1 of them now. So those are Schedule 2, no refills allowed by law. Schedules 3 through 5 are not as highly regulated because they have less potential for abuse and less potential for addiction. Almost everybody in the world is on a Schedule 3 through 5 medicine. I'm on one myself for sleep. Schedule 3 would be the most addictive, the most potential for abuse, and it goes down as you get to Schedule 5, but it doesn't really matter where these drugs find themselves because the laws are the same for all of them. These are your drugs where the maximum number of refills is 5 and the maximum length of prescription is 6 months. Sometimes we have people that are really, really confused. They'll come in and ask for a refill. We'll say, I'm sorry, this prescription is expired. And the patient will say, no, I got 2 refills, you know. And this may have happened to a lot of you before. My particular prescription expires after 6 months as well. But just understand, the law says 5 refills or 6 months. So if your prescription has the refills left, but the pharmacy tells you it's expired, this is why. Some of your drugs that are more popular in these categories would be your testosterone type products, your benzodiazepines. Those are your medicines like Xanax or Restoril. That's the one I take. That's a sleep medicine. Temazepam. Your Ativan. So a lot of your drugs for anxiety. Some of your drugs for sleep like Ambien. A lot of you guys are probably on Ambien. A whole lot of people certainly are. And then the least regulated ones would be things like your Robitussin AC. That's a cough medicine that has codeine in it. Some of your medicines for diarrhea like Lomotil. So anyway, those are the difference between Schedule 2, no refills, and Schedules 3 through 5, maximum 5 refills or 6 months. That's a lot of information, but I think that's important, the practical stuff that I think they care about.
So what about avoiding these type drugs?
You know, the truth is that in general, yes, if you can, you should avoid these drugs, but they're also available and allowed by the DEA for a reason, because they do have a purpose. And I have some patients that will say, I'm just not going to take any of these medicines no matter what. Well, even the most highly regulated of these medicines, like your Percocets, like your Norcos, like your Adderalls and Ritalins, they have a medical use. And so if a person, we probably have more people taking ADHD medicine than should. But if a person truly has ADHD, then these medicines can help them to function, to help them in school, or to help them to focus at work, those sort of things. If a person's had surgery, you most certainly don't want to deny them access to these type pain medicines. So, as a patient, yeah, absolutely. If you can avoid these medicines, you should. But there are also times that you need them. When you start looking at the other schedules, they're a lot more commonly used. There are people who have anxiety. So you may be looking at a medication that's like an Ativan or Ativan or a Xanax, those type of medicines. Should you take 3 or 4 of them or 5 of them every day? No, of course not. But when you need them, and I think this is part of the role of the pharmacist, to make people understand when you need it, it's okay, but get by with as little as possible. I think that's important. Sleep medicine's the same way. Like I said, I can't sleep at all without my medication. There you go. It goes back to your addiction potential.
Yeah, and before we go this morning, and we appreciate you sharing this, a lot of good people end up getting just upside down with controlled substances.
Yeah, this is one of the more difficult things to deal with as a pharmacist. You know, as a pharmacist, you see the prescriptions from the doctor. It's my job to give those medicines out. Those decisions, right, are made by the physicians. There are some times where you see people who you can tell that this has become a problem for them. And so the best rule of thumb, I guess, is something I've already said, which is use the medicines if you have to, but use as little as you possibly can. And I think that's the best way to avoid it. If you can avoid taking them all together, that's great. If you have a major surgery, you're not going to be able to, for example. But then when you're done with them, or you can go to ibuprofen instead of continuing to take the pain medicine, you'll be better off in that situation.
All right, man. Appreciate you joining us this morning. Controlled Substances with pharmacist Jerry Jacobs from Marble City Pharmacy. And